In my adolescent years, I was an avid reader of any book I could get my hands on that was a retelling of a classic fairy tale. I loved knowing the bones of a story and guessing what twist it would have this time around. I loved the familiar storylines involving poison, princesses, and powerful messages. I loved the fantasy settings mixed in with the occasional modern elements. When these adaptations and retellings are compared to their classic counterparts, it helps highlight just how depressing and grim, pun intended, these original stories really are. These newer versions of the stories provide resistance to the old-fashioned stereotypes that the originals enforce by using different narratives from what's expected, especially when it comes to the definition of the words good, bad, monstrous, and innocent. Sometimes fairy tales can make these words seem very black and white, but when you read books and watch movies with these newer narrative retellings, you learn that people aren't born as monsters, and that personalities are nuanced due to each person's backstory and life events. In different iterations of fairy tales like Snow White, the characters are depicted in more complex and realistic ways over time. These retellings blur the lines of what it means to be bad or monstrous. They show that what is traditionally thought of as good can in some ways be bad, what is traditionally thought of as bad can in some ways be good, and the idea of monstrosity can mean more than what it is traditionally thought to mean. In between battles of good versus bad and monstrous versus innocent is a middle ground of normality, which mixes the two sides together into a state that most people fit into without even realizing. The original Brothers Grimm story of Little Snow White is about Snow White versus her evil stepmother. As writers Gilbert and Gubar describe it in their essay, The Queen's Looking Glass, it is a story of the angel woman and the monster woman. In other words, Snow White and her evil stepmother are juxtaposed personalities. One is an innocent, naive child, the other is a vain and harsh old woman. But they are both stuck in their own, both metaphorical and real, glass entrapments, forced to play out a role. The reader is meant to idolize Snow White. We are meant to want to be like her, to be sweet and kind so that everyone will like us. We are meant to dislike the evil queen because she is villainous and evil. But what is obvious to modern audiences that wasn't as clear when the story first came out in 1812 is that Snow White is passive and emotionless, and the evil queen is confident and expressive. When the evil queen approaches the dwarf's house, Snow White lets herself be deceived and opens the door. She is portrayed as helpless and dumb. Meanwhile, the evil queen has hobbies, such as the art of witchcraft and disguising herself into a different person. Although she uses these talents for evil intent, it shows that she has an actual personality and interests, unlike Snow White. Therefore, Snow White isn't as ideal as she seems to be at first, and the evil queen isn't as unideal as she seems to be at first. Neither the evil queen nor Snow White are what people want to become, but the evil queen has more fun with her role than Snow White because she is allowed to be herself. Perhaps then the word monstrosity that is often pushed onto villains such as the evil queen is just a word, one that demonizes women who express themselves. Jumping ahead 200 years after the publication of Little Snow White, a book called The Land of Stories: The Wishing Spell came out in 2012 and was popular among young children at the time, like me. It tells the story of two siblings in the modern day getting sucked into their grandmother's book of fairy tales and getting to meet the heroes of their childhood like Cinderella, Goldilocks, Sleeping Beauty, and more. As they travel through the land of stories, attempting to find their way back to the real world, they discover that Snow White's evil stepmother has escaped from jail to cause trouble, and the two children somehow get swept up into the chaos. At first, the characterization of Snow White and the evil queen in this version of the story appears to be the same, with Snow White's naivety and the evil queen's ambition. However, unlike the original fairy tale, this book gives depth into the backstory of how the evil queen became the way she is. In this version of the story, the evil queen was once a young woman named Evely, and was in love with a man named Mira. But when an evil enchantress turned Mira into a magic mirror, Evely was heartbroken and cut out her heart so that she would no longer feel emotions, thus turning her into the literal heartless woman obsessed with her mirror that we see in the classic story. A conversation between Snow White and the Evil Queen reveals just how much this backstory ended up affecting the relationship between the two women. The Evil Queen reflects by saying, "I've done so many terrible things in my time, but many terrible things have been done to me over time as well. So as far as I'm concerned, the world and I are even." Her criticism gives validation to why she did what she did, which is exactly what Snow White has come to ask her about. Snow White then reveals her side of the story, of why she kept letting the Queen attempt to kill her and why she didn't kill the Evil Queen in this version of the story. Snow White explains, "Like it or not, you are the only mother I've ever known. I refuse to believe that you are the soulless monster the rest of the world claims you to be." These statements explain the reasoning behind the baffling amount of innocence bordering on stupidity that Snow White shows in the original tale. She craved a motherly figure, but the Evil Queen was unable to provide that, even uninterested in providing that, due to her obsession with trying to rescue her lover from the mirror. The reason she tried to kill Snow White was because Mira was beginning to confuse Snow White for what Evely had looked like when she was younger. She was beginning to replace Evely as the fairest one of all. The Evil Queen is still a villain, and she still attempted to murder a young girl. But this provides a more human reasoning behind those actions. It also shows Snow White as more of a person and not just a pretty object as she is in the original tale. About a year after The Land of Stories was published, the story of Snow White was taken another step further via Ever After High, a Mattel franchise that included 3 junior novels, a huge line of dolls, and a series of short animated online episodes. Collectively, they tell the stories of the children of characters from well-known fairy tales. This includes Raven Queen, the daughter of the Evil Queen, and Apple White, the daughter of Snow White. They are destined to follow in their parents' footsteps and continue the story of Snow White. Conflict quickly arises, however, when it becomes clear that Raven is nowhere near as evil as her mother and doesn't want to kill Apple because Apple is her friend. Apple, on the other hand, is desperately trying to convince Raven to become evil, because if Raven never poisons her, then she will never marry a prince, become queen, and get her happily ever after ending. Just like how people view Snow White in the original tale, everyone loves Apple White. On her first day of school, people see her and faint. One girl sighs and calls Apple gorgeous, and the school giant offers to carry her books for her. When people see Raven, however, they view her much as they view her mother. People shout, "It's Raven Queen, run!" and she is evil. This version of the story emphasizes how Raven doesn't want to follow in her mother's villainous path. And she herself states, "I want to choose my own happily ever after." Much like Evely's backstory, this iteration of the Evil Queen is understandable. If Raven doesn't want to be evil, why would she follow her destiny to become the Evil Queen? Unfortunately, Apple doesn't see Raven's side of the story. She is arguably more self-obsessed than Raven, which is ironic given that vanity is a trait of the original Evil Queen. Apple states, "I can't wait for everyone to get a glimpse of the queen I'm going to become." And she also talks her friends' ears off about how important Raven is to her destiny. It's almost as though she doesn't see Raven as a person, but as a step in her overall plan to greatness. Ever After High's retelling of Snow White breaks the boundaries of monstrosity even more than The Land of Stories does, by not just elaborating on the personalities of the good character and the bad character, but also by flipping the script on the characters' actions and the intentions behind their actions. The idea of monstrosity as presented in classic fairy tales like Little Snow White is very black and white, but newer retellings like The Land of Stories and Ever After High mix the two sides together into a gray area. What is a villain? What is a victim? Who's the monster? It's all a gray area. Language, like everything in life, changes over time as society and culture shift. Therefore, the idea of monstrosity has also changed from the way it was originally presented in the Brothers Grimm Little Snow White. This change is important to take note of because as a society, we've come a long way from the medieval-like ideas of women needing to be innocent, kind, and obedient in order to prove their worth. Retellings of fairy tales that put a different twist on the meaning of monstrosity help push forward this much-needed change. The Land of Stories, Ever After High, and other modern fairy tale retellings such as Disney movies, the movie Hoodwinked, the Whatever After book series, the TV show Once Upon a Time, and authors like Angela Carter will all last through time. They will continue to make lasting changes for generations. People in the future might rediscover them and realize the good messages that they held and still hold. In some cases, these retellings might be randomly remembered by adults who used to love them as children. They can look back on them and realize the importance of being brought up on stories with strong female characters who were neither an angel woman nor a monster woman. Words and language are powerful, and they can affect the world for the better. Each one of the Snow White stories has their own powerful message. Whether the message is good or bad is up for debate, as good and bad are relative. I don't think society needs to worry about anyone reading Snow White and dreaming of becoming an evil queen who kills children and takes over copious amounts of land. But someone might be inspired to wear bold clothing or speak up about what they believe in. In that same sense, I don't think anyone really wants to become Snow White either. Ideally, personalities are a mix of bad and good, to be a complex, realistic, individual person. Everyone lives in that gray space in between, because monstrous is just a concept. In The Land of Stories, the Evil Queen says something that has stuck with me since I first read the book 13 years ago. A villain is just a victim whose story hasn't been told. Words are just words. What really matters is the personality inside someone. The question remains, where does the new Snow White movie fit into all of this? But to answer that, we must first look at Disney's original Snow White movie. The 1937 Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs more or less follows the same exact plot of the Grimm brothers' Little Snow White. The evil queen wants to be the fairest one in the land, but when her magic mirror tells her that Snow White is fairer, she sends her huntsman to kill Snow White, which he is unable to bring himself to do. Alone and scared, Snow White finds refuge in a cottage that belongs to 7 dwarfs. When the dwarfs find her, one of them says, "She's beautiful, just like an angel," which harkens back to the scene in the original story, where when the dwarfs find her and say, "Oh good heaven, this child is so beautiful," as well as Gilbert and Gubar's description of Snow White as the angel woman. Unlike in the Grimm story, however, when Snow White informs the dwarves that her stepmother, the queen, wants to kill her, the dwarves already seem to know that the queen is evil. They say, "She's wicked, she's bad, she's mighty mean." Snow White doesn't even appear to suspect her stepmother is evil until the huntsman tells Snow White that it was the queen who ordered him to kill her. Throughout the whole movie, Snow White seems to have this relentless optimism, where she automatically assumes the best of everyone. In some instances, this optimism pays off, like when she apologizes after frightening the woodland animals, and they repay her by leading her to the dwarves' cottage. However, this also means that when the queen, disguised as an old woman, shows up, Snow White doesn't even think that this might be her stepmother. The birds can tell that the old woman is evil, but when they attack her, Snow White scolds them for hurting an old woman. The evil queen doesn't even have to trick Snow White into eating the apple because, from Snow White's perspective, there's nothing to distrust. Is this optimism naivety or stupidity? Maybe. But Snow White is also a child, a fact that is often forgotten about in both this movie and in the original tale. Perhaps she just hasn't yet learned the dangers of the world around her. This is especially true in the Disney movie because, unlike the original story where the queen personally tries to kill Snow White on 3 separate occasions, She only makes one attempt in the movie. Snow White isn't making the same mistakes over and over, she only makes it once. Just like all the other adaptations, there is a heavy emphasis on Snow White's beauty in this movie. The magic mirror tells the queen, "Famed is thy beauty, majesty, but hold, a lovely maid I see. Rags cannot hide her gentle grace. Alas, she is more fair than thee." The queen is also beautiful, but apparently not as much as Snow White, even when the queen forces her to wear rags to appear uglier. Ugliness is also how the queen disguises herself. Now a formula to transform my beauty into ugliness. She is beautiful, just not as beautiful as Snow White. This is interesting because when looking at the two characters in this movie, they both have the same fair skin, red lips, and blushing cheeks. There's no real reason for Snow White to be seen as fairer than the queen, except perhaps in her personality. Snow White is kind to the animals and the dwarves, where the queen is vengeful and murderous. There is also no motivation for the queen in this story, except for her need to be the most beautiful. It's like some sort of fucked up beauty pageant that only the queen is aware of and Snow White doesn't even know she's participating in. So that's weird. In Disney's 1937 Snow White, the ideas of good and evil are presented as very black and white, much like in the original Brothers Grimm story. Snow White is kind and is rewarded. The evil queen is cruel and is punished. Snow White gets a happily ever after, and the evil queen falls off a cliff. There is still the same problem that there is in the original story, however, where the audience is supposed to idealize Snow White, but realistically, no one wants to sing to animals and cook and clean for 7 men. The queen's potions are meant to be terrifying, yes, but they also look fun with puffs of smoke and bubbling cauldrons. Once again, we come to the same conclusion. Good and bad are just words, and people can and should have a combination of the two concepts. And now, on to the 2025 Snow White. It follows the same plot lines about the 1937 movie and the 1812 story, with Snow White running away from her evil stepmother, finding the 7 dwarves' cottage, and eventually being poisoned by the apple before being woken up and getting her happily ever after. Just like in the 1937 movie, Snow White doesn't suspect that her stepmother is evil until she witnesses it. In this case, when the queen ties Jonathan, a thief, to the castle gates. Snow White ends up freeing Jonathan, showing that she has more agency in this movie. But when he tells her to run away from the palace so she can actually help her people, she doesn't go. She doesn't really give a reason, except for later when she says, "I can't leave the kingdom," despite her being helpless if she stays. Perhaps Snow White doesn't want to admit her helplessness and believes that if she stays in the castle, she can maybe do some good from the inside. Unfortunately, the only time that works is when she frees Jonathan, because then the queen is determined to kill her and she has to run away. There are some differences with the evil queen in this version of the story as well. While in the 1937 movie she could do magic via spellbooks and potions, in this one she can prestidigitize items out of thin air like flowers and gems. This shows that her magic comes from within her and is not taught to her from books, which adds a layer of interest. The evil queen also sings, "Ambitious girls must be vicious girls, and boy do they have fun." And aside from the questionable lyric choices, this shows the same characterization as in the old movie and in the original story. Here, the evil queen gives us her motivation for being evil. She's evil because she's ambitious, because she wants power, and because she has fun when she's being mean. She also implies in this same song that she is the fairest of all, because beauty doesn't come from inside a person like Snow White's kindness, it comes from raw outer beauty like what the queen has. Although this is what the queen believes, the movie and the magic mirror make it clear that fairness and beauty do actually come from within, which is a nice change from the older movie and the original story. However, the movie seems to get confused on whether fairness and beauty are one and the same. There's beeping from construction outside, and I'm really sorry if you can hear it, but I am going to keep filming, so. The idea of fairness has changed over time, from 1812 to 1937 to 2025, so it makes sense that it might mean something different in this new movie. When the magic mirror tells the queen Snow White is fairer than her, it holds a different meaning because now fair is interpreted as just and true. Or at least that's what the movie seems to want the audience to think. Snow White does appear to have this sense of fairness that the queen does not, when she says the punishment must not exceed the crime, something she learned from her father. This is an intelligent and kind thought process that is not shown in the 1937 nor 1812 versions of Snow White. It seems like a big step up in advancing her personality. She's not just kind, she's just and a good ruler and is just as beautiful on the inside as she is on the outside. And then the movie starts to get confusing. There's a point where, when the queen believes Snow White to be dead, she has the royal guards announce to the kingdom, "All hail the queen, fairest of all." In this instance, fair cannot mean the same as just, because certainly there are people who have a better sense of justice than the queen. So then, does fair go back to meaning beauty? At this point in other versions of the story, it's quite literal. Snow White is the most beautiful, she dies, now the evil queen is left to be the most beautiful. Words can mean multiple things at the same time. That is a part of the point this essay is trying to make. But this is Snow White. This is the fairest of them all. This is a story with such a simple message. So why does the movie complicate that message by not sticking to one specific theme? Is this a movie about justice or beauty? It can be both, but we're never really given a clear answer on whether or not it is. Towards the end of the movie, the mirror says that the queen's beauty is only skin deep, but Snow White's beauty comes from within, which is the same traditional message delivered in the previous iterations of the story. But then, why put such an emphasis on fair equaling just if in the end it all comes back to beauty? Even if beauty comes from within and not outside, the plot still boils down to a fucked up beauty pageant. This movie wants to be about the bravery of societal change and also a pretty princess doing pretty princess things. The reason Snow White works so well as a story is because the message is not that deep. It's simple to understand, which leaves a lot of room for interpretation, as seen in the rest of this essay. But by trying to give the story more depth than what is actually there, it ends up just being about nothing. In the final moments of this movie, the evil queen shatters her magic mirror out of anger, and when she does so, she shatters too. Literally, she falls apart into the air. This is never explained. It could be interpreted as her vanity being her downfall, or her magic mirror getting revenge, but there's no proper answer. The audience is left with questions. Did she lose because she is evil, or because she liked being evil? Did she die? Or vanish into the mirror dimension like an Ever After High? Was this movie actually just about beauty this whole time, and it tried to trick us into thinking it was about creating a fair government for all? Not to mention questions about the movie overall, like, why did Disney waste Pasek and Paul's songwriting talents on this soulless cash grab? Why does Dopey's character arc end with his disability getting fixed? Why is Gal Gadot so staunchly pro-genocide and still getting high-paying jobs? I need a second. At the end of the day, it's just a movie. For children and Disney adults. There are good things about this version of Snow White, just like how there are good things about all the other versions discussed in this essay. It's hard to say if the 2025 Snow White grasps good versus evil as concepts, because it's hard to say if the 2025 Snow White grasped any concepts at all. This version of the story may not work that well as an adaptation of the 1937 Snow White, but it does fit in with other retellings of the original Brothers Grimm story. This is a story where Snow White has agency, depth, and backstory, and where the evil queen has magic, power, and a desire to kill innocent children in Palestine. Sorry. Kill the innocent child, Snow White. My bad. When I wrote the first part of this essay 3 years ago, I said, words are just words. What really matters is the personality inside someone. And the same logic can be extended to this movie. It's not good or bad. It just is. And it certainly has personality. Also, this is a side note, but my favorite part of the whole movie is when the dwarves arrive back at home and this one guy goes, "It is indeed splendid to be back in our place of habitation," or whatever he says. I'm gonna insert the clip here. Why is that so funny? Why is that the best part of the movie? Why is it so good? The rest of the movie, I'm good. But that, I'm gonna be saying that for the rest of my life. I'm sorry.
Oh, sweetheart. It is indeed exceptional to be back at our place of habitation.
Hey gang, I didn't write an outro for this part of the video. I'm just sort of saying things. So editing Katie, have fun with this. Do you guys like my new sweatshirt? It's from Lake Michigan. I went to Michigan for the first time recently. Anywho, I was originally gonna make this video about different adaptations of Hamlet, but I didn't want to do 2 Hamlet videos back to back. I do really like Hamlet, but I don't want this to be like a Hamlet exclusive video essay channel, you know what I mean? So then I remembered this essay that I wrote 3 years ago and how it's about fairy tale adaptations and Snow White, and I figured that was topical. So then I rewatched the 1937 Snow White and I watched the 2025 Snow White for the first time, and it made me want to die a little bit, not gonna lie. Yeah, I could do a whole video just talking about my thoughts on Snow White. I could do a whole video talking about my thoughts on different fairy tale adaptations. I could do a video on Hoodwinked, on Ever After High. Like, if you want me to do more of this kind of stuff, let me know. I am gonna put out that Hamlet video eventually, just maybe I'll do another one on a different topic. I don't really know what I want my next video to be. I have a pretty good essay about Beauty and the Beast, if you guys want more like Disney movie fairy tale stuff. It's not the live action Beauty and the Beast, it's the original 90s animated one. But yeah, I have loads of random essays that I've written. I have essays that I want to write for this channel. And yeah, I just really like literary examinations and the like. So leave a like on this video if you liked it. Please comment and share if you want to. And yeah, thanks for watching. Have a great day. I'll see you in the next one. What am I doing? Due to each person's slay. Glass and but they are both stuck in their own, both metaphorical and real, glass entrapments. Glass entrapments. She was beginning to... Oops. About a year after The Land of Stories was published, with Snow White running away from her evil stepmother, finding the Sweven. Snow White running away from her evil stepmother, finding the Sweven. I keep saying Sweven! There is a point where, when the queen believes Snow White